Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Despite the weather, growers have managed to apply all of the nitrogen to winter barley, and their attention will now turn to disease control. Depending on the part of the country you farm in, this will to some degree dictate how you approach this fungicide strategy. This is due to the weather conditions in the south of the country, which can drive wet weather diseases, and a little bit differently being drier in the north. Other factors can all have a major influence, including variety and how and when you time your fungicide. I'm delighted to be joined on the Tillage Edge by Dr. Stephen Kildea from Teagasc in Oak Park to bring all these parts of the puzzle together. Stephen, you're very welcome. I just first wanted to ask you, what are the top three things a farmer should look for when the farmer's trying to devise a fungicide strategy for winter barley?
Okay, so really the first thing that they should be looking at is the variety, because this is going to give the inherent risk of a disease that might be in that crop. So, and to do that, look, they're going to be looking at something, looking at the recommended lists where the department have reviewed or evaluated the different varieties and scored them for the different diseases that are there. Second thing is, look, just because a variety has a rating for a certain disease doesn't mean that that disease will be in that crop in any given stage. So they're going to have to get into that crop and see what's there. Also, the ratings that are given are sort of a mean of the various different sites where these things are evaluated. And some sites might have more disease than others. So really, it provides an indication of the level of disease. But as I say, getting into that crop is really what's going to be important to see what's there. And then the third thing, of course, is going to be the risk of what's going to happen over the next few weeks, because that's really what the farmer's trying to do and develop a fungicide strategy, is to protect that crop for the next few weeks. And this is going to be based on the weather sort of forecast that's going to be there. Does it look like it's going to be a wet, a windy, a cool and damp sort of conditions? That's going to drive the disease. And so really looking at that is going to be very important also.
Okay. And Stephen, is there a particular disease that's most problematic in the early season for barley?
Yeah, so look, we can look at the range of diseases that come into barley, and the one that would spring out straight away in terms of winter barley at this time of the year is going to be something like rhynchosporium, because this is a cool sort of weather disease. It's a wet weather disease, and that's what we're after coming from in winter months, cool and wet generally. So rhyncho would be one that I would be looking out for. The other one, of course, is going to be mildew, because look, although it's cool and wet, mildew will proliferate in that type of weather conditions also. So they're really the two that I would be concentrating a lot on. That said, other diseases such as net blotch will be there in certain crops in some years, so it's potentially there also. And
when you're saying that, then for if you come back to this year and for the crops that are out there at the moment, how much disease is out there at the moment, and what is there a particular disease and a particular variety growers should be more worried about?
Yeah, so I've been around the country in the last, couple of days trying to get samples for analysis. And I've been in a few crops. The disease, of course, that stands out is rhynchosporium. And again, it comes back to that first question about what sort of things should be looking at, and that's variety. And really the varieties such as something like cassia and pixel are carrying a high level of rhynchosporium at the moment, especially down south. The other disease that I did notice in pixel was net blotch, surprisingly, more net blotch than I would have anticipated. So they're really the two diseases that are there at the moment. Mildew would normally be there at a high level in cassia. There's not a huge amount of that there at the moment, probably reflecting the cooler sort of late winter that we had this year.
Okay. And Stephen, obviously you were doing a lot of research year on year, and in barley there's various different results coming back. Is there any bit of a tweak that's needed to our advice based on results over the last year or so?
I suppose over the last year or so, or a couple of years, being honest, it's got to do, one of the major things would have to do with fungicide resistance and the different sort of pathogens or different diseases that we're looking at, and they're tailoring the fungicide program to match those, being honest, is what's very important. And the biggest factor, look, being honest, is going to be a later season, and we're talking about the loss of chlorothalonil for ramularia and the impact of SDHI resistance, drug resistance, and azole resistance on ramularia. But at this stage, I suppose one of the factors that we would be looking at and have been looking at over the last number of years in research is the timing of applications and the amount of fungicide that's going to be required. And that's going to come back down to those sort of first questions about what disease, what risk, what variety, and things like that, and understanding what disease is in the crop and matching the fungicide to that.
Okay, and in the past, or up, I suppose up till now, Stephen, we've had a scenario whereby we've been telling growers that something like a half rate a number of different times is probably you're probably going to get the best effect out of that. But does that hold or hold true reasonably well, even where there is a high level of disease going in?
So with the high level of disease at this stage, we have to be looking at the crop and understanding, I suppose, how is yield being created in these crops. And at this stage, what we're trying to do is basically maintain those tillers so that we get basic heads and we can fill those grains that are subsequently going to emerge. If we lose tillers at this stage due to disease, then we've lost yield even before we even think about grain filling. So really, in terms of if there's a high level of disease at this stage, it's about getting into that crop and protecting those tillers. And that results in a winter barley tree spray type program. And a half rate of a mixed products at that stage is sufficient in that type of a program, being honest. But it will come back down to what diseases are there, and I suppose then matching that disease to the various different products that are going to be required or can be used on that.
Okay. And we know that prothioconazole, or proline, if you like, being a popular trade name for it, is recognized as a really, really good barley fungicide. Why should growers add to that, or is it just good enough to use that on its own, or what risks would that pose?
So the first thing to say is, look, we recognise prothioconazole has been an excellent fungicide in barley. It has covered a lot of diseases. However, look, as time has gone on, I suppose resistance has developed to ramularia, to Prothio. So that's the very first thing. It wouldn't necessarily be the absolute strongest, maybe on net blotch. It is very effective. What we might want to add, if we got a high level of net blotch, we want to add another mixture into that. And that's really what we're talking about in terms of mixtures. It's matching the products to the disease spectrum that might be there. So Prothio will be excellent in say, Rhynchosporium. It will be very good on net blotch, but it might be weak on ramularia. So we then need to match it so that we're first of all providing the desired sort of disease control. But secondly, look, as I say, it has been an excellent fungicide in barley. We want to make sure that it continues to be an excellent fungicide to Rhynchosporium, to mildew, to net blotch. And the best way to do that is actually going to be to provide an anti-resistance strategy. And key to that is going to be mixing it with a different mode of action so that we're actually protecting it going forward. So as I say, a very, very important mode of action in barley, and one that we do need to protect going forward.
And when you say just put in an extra mode of action, is that, is it good enough just to put in Folpid, for instance, the same as kind of chlorothalonil maybe in the past, or are you talking about SDHIs, or are you talking about other modes of action that are really necessary there?
So I suppose when we're talking about barley, we're talking about a spectrum of diseases generally, and you really need to, as I say, match what you're going to be putting into that tank to the diseases that are going to be in your crop, but also the risk of diseases that could well emerge over the season. And that's really what's going to be important. So say with that proline and Folpid, yeah, that for me would be a good mixture for ramularia. However, we're now at a targeted point where ramularia isn't the main target. We undoubtedly will be getting some level of ramularia control at this application, but Rhyncho will be there, potentially mildew, potentially net blotch. And we need to mix and match the various actives for that. So a proline Folpid at this stage would only get you probably the Rhynchosporium control, and it's not going to give you, and the net blotch control, but it's not going to give you protection of that Prothio. The Folpid won't give you the protection of Prothio at this stage. So you're going to need to be looking at, say, a strobilurine for that Rhyncho control and that net blotch control at this stage.
Okay, so maybe we just, if you like, head out to the fields, and if we maybe think about maybe down south, and maybe a crop of, let's just say, tower, and there's active Rhyncho in that tower. At this stage of the year, if you like, kind of today, if you like, what should be the action there? And maybe you might be able to give us an example of the types of products that you would think that would be reasonably suitable for that.
Yeah, so tower would actually be, it's a good example because it'll have a bit of everything being in it, being honest. It won't just be the Rhyncho. I'd expect a high level of the spot form and net blotch. So yeah, and potentially some mildew and a little bit of rust potentially also there. So you've got that spectrum of disease where you're actually going to need the various different actors for control. So look, Prothio for your Rinco for a bit of the net blotch control, and then I'd be looking for something that, say, in Tar specifically, it's going to have that susceptibility, a high level of susceptibility to the spot former net blotch. So I'd be looking at something like a Comet or a Paraclostrobin type active included in that. So that's your Prothio and your Paraclostrobin should cover a lot of those diseases. The Prothio will cover the mildew, very good in the Rinco, very good in net blotch, and then your Paraclostrobin will be very good on the net blotch, and it'll be very good also on the Rinco. So you're getting a good coverage there.
And to a degree, Stephen, Prothio is probably going to be the core to that. Could you swap out the Comet and put in, with a Comet being a straub, and put in an SDHI in its place, or is Comet the kind of really what you would stick with?
So within that Tar example, I think I would be sticking with the Comet, that Paraclostrobin, and the reason being that we do know that there is a high level of net blotch, sort of resistance in net blotch to the SDHIs, and that will impact the activity of the SDHIs to net blotch. We know that also there is some strobilurine resistance based on a mutation called F129L. It affects some of the strobilurines more than others, and something like Paraclostrobin isn't as impacted. And knowing this is very important in terms of if there is net blotch in the crop, also if there's a risk in that variety to net blotch. It would be very important to be looking at that in terms of how we look and control net blotch.
Now, if we maybe just take something similar, let's just take Tower, and we're instead of planting it maybe somewhere down around Cork direction, we're going to plant it somewhere up around the Meath direction. Go into that crop today, largely clean. There's a bit of old Rinco kind of kicking around there at the base, but relatively speaking, relatively clean. And I suppose the crop is only after waking up over the last maybe week or so. What would be the advice there?
So the advice there would be, it is slightly different, because what you're looking for at this early spray is to protect those tillers, and if those tillers aren't going to be coming under I suppose stress or potential damage from the disease, then basically the benefit of that application at this stage will be lower. So you may actually then be able to, I suppose you're going to have to look at the risks, as I say, and the variety, of course, it will have a certain risk, and that will be Rinco and net blotch. If they're not there, that risk becomes lower. It doesn't completely remove the risk because it's an inherent risk in the variety. But I would monitor it. I would say, does it require that application at this stage immediately to protect those tillers? Possibly not. You can get into that stem extension, and I suppose they're our traditional first application. And at that stage, you're starting to move into the stem extension, and you're looking to protect that upper canopy. That's going to be important during grain filling.
So maybe just looking at a few of the other varieties that are kind of popular out there, is there any particular disease that growers should be looking out for that matches in with that variety that is of particular concern?
Yeah, so if we go through the main varieties, look, Cassia has been there for 10 years, if not more at this stage. We know what its strengths are in sort of things like quality, etc. But we also know what its weaknesses are. And one of its biggest weaknesses will be rhincosporium and mildew susceptibility. So you're going to have to be looking at those ones. They're the ones that at this stage, especially down south, I'd be saying, look, I'd get into the crops, seeing how much damage both of those are disease potentially could be causing. Is it killing tillers? Has it the potential to kill tillers over the next 10 days or so? And then something also then like Pixel. Pixel is a 6-row variety. It has become quite susceptible to rhincosporium in recent years. Again, is it damaging in those tillers potentially? Also, as I say, look, I was surprised to see quite a lot of net blotch in Pixel over the last few days. And that's a disease that could get going if the weather sort of warms up a little bit, and it'll be a little bit more difficult potentially to control it slightly later on, because it will cycle that little bit faster as the temperatures start to increase. Some other varieties, Infinity, for example, it is carrying Nodorum, Parastogonospora nodorum. It's not one we would see too often. Its impact on yields probably would be maybe during grain filling, but it's one that I would be keeping an eye on also.
So Stephen, kind of just one last question. We haven't really mentioned the hybrids so far. Is there any different strategy that growers should take into account in terms of disease control on hybrids versus conventional varieties?
And from a disease control perspective, no. And I think it's basically what are the risks of the disease, what is the susceptibility of the crops, etc. And they tend to be more resistant to the range of different diseases. Now that said, I've been in crops in the last week where there has been quite a bit of wrinkle in some of them. They would need to be watched. But overall, the strategies will be the same. You need to protect those tillers and then protect the upper canopy for grain filling. Now, and that comes back down to the levels of disease that will be in the crop at the moment and the risks of disease going forward, including the susceptibilities of the actual varieties themselves.
Okay, so I suppose, as you said at the very start, one of the key aspects of it is to get into your crops and stay in the crops, stay assessing crops and assessing how disease is progressing in crops.
Absolutely.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time. Delighted to get all that information from you. And look, we'll have you back again in a few weeks' time again. Thanks, Stephen.
No problem. All right, best of luck.
So that's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Stephen for joining me on the podcast. The next episode in the series of the Crop Agronomy webinars is on next Tuesday, April the 6th at 11:30 a.m. For more details, go to www.teagasc.ie/events. Don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more farming news, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.